This is the Germans from Russia Experience, Episode 8, The Berg Family Story, with descendant Tracy Heffington. Welcome to the Germans from Russia Experience. I am your host, Alisa Rodriguez, and I am here to inspire you and others to learn anything and everything about your own family heritage by providing information, experiences, and stories about a special group of people, the Germans from Russia. Happy New Year! I am Alisa, and today I have a special family story to share with you. I first met Tracy along with her mother and sister a few years back as they came into the Central California chapter of the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia building to explore the museum and research library. They also brought along Tracy's grandmother, who you will hear about in this Berg Family Story. Tracy and I sat down just after Christmas as she shared parts of her family story with me. As we spoke, I discovered themes throughout that were very similar to my family story. I hope you find connections as well, along with inspiration to dig more into your family history. Enjoy! Well, good morning. Thank you, Tracy, for being here today. I'm so excited for you to tell my listeners your family story.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about it. I love hearing other people's stories.
Me too.
And, I never really thought much about what kind of story it was or kind of how it fit in. It was a story that I had heard.
Yeah.
So I think, hearing those stories it teaches us so much. So,
it does, yes. And then we want to know more about our own families that way.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. I think there's just so much that we learn when we hear those stories.
Yeah, and of course I've heard most of your story or part of your story before, and there are parts that are similar to my own family, which
Sure.
I think my listeners will find.
Yeah.
And then there's also very interesting, unique things about your
Right.
family story, and that's always a surprise, and also what makes us different.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Those commonalities are so fascinating. And then when we find those differences too, it, kind of teaches us something else.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So where would you like to start?
Well, I guess I'll start kind of in the beginning. My great-great-grandparents were part of a group that left the Volga area to come to the United States in 1887. And they came, there's a large travel group that they came with. And as the story goes, when they were on the train headed to Lincoln, Nebraska, someone approached them on the train and said, if you're interested in farming, if you're interested in agriculture, there's great promise in this area called Fresno. You should consider going to Fresno instead of Lincoln. So as the story goes, 8 families stayed on the train. They continued on to Fresno. The rest of the party that they were traveling with, I think there was close to 200 people, got off in Lincoln. They continued on to Fresno. They were met in Fresno. This kind of group just arrives. There's an article from the Fresno Republican about the day they arrived, and my great-great-grandparents were part of that party. They were 35 when they arrived. Their names were Johann August Berg and Katerina Volmer Berg. And with them, they had 3 children. They had Marie, Johann Peter, who was later called Peter, and Heinrich, who was called Henry. So they arrived in June 1887. And I always think it's a little bit funny. We know that when they left Russia, all the groups, when they left Russia, one of the things they prayed for, that they asked for was, to bring them to the Summerland. And then they arrive in Fresno in June.
Right.
It could not be more of the Summerland.
Sure. It's a lot more desolate then, too, from the pictures we've seen.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It was not the the Fresno that we know now. It was, the smaller town, but also the agriculture industry was just starting. Then about 9 months later, they had a son. That is my great-grandfather. His name was Daniel. He was born on August 11th, 1888. So it was actually his dad, John's, birthday. And he was, as the family would be so proud to say, he was the first German from Russia baby born in Fresno.
Yes, yes. And the group that came was the first Volga Germans that came to Fresno. So,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
That's
unique, yes.
probably one of the most unique and key parts to that. They decided, they stayed on that train. And, as we know, many, many people followed.
That's right. Including my families and many other families. Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So eventually, John and Catherine, as they kind of became known, they settled west of Fresno, and they had raisins. That's what they grew. They were raisin growers. And we've actually learned, and just kind of doing research, that John was an early member of Kearney's California Raisin Growers Association, which is the group that eventually evolved. It kind of took some twists and turns, but it became Sun-Made Growers of California. They didn't live much longer. They lived until their 60s. So they spent just under half their life living in the United States, in California. In all, they had 7 children. After Daniel was born, they had 3 more, Margaret, Herman, and August. And from those 7 children, they had 46 grandchildren.
Oh, wow. That's quite a group.
Yeah. So big families were common, including my grandmother. And her name was Margaret Berg. So she was very proud to be part of this group. She would always tell you, my dad was an American because he was born here.
Yeah.
But very proud also that she was part of the Volga German story.
Yes. That's great.
Yeah. So I always think kind of what's interesting is what happened to those seven children. I never met them. They would be my great aunts and uncles. But what I know about them is from my grandma. She loved to tell stories. She was a storyteller. And 3 of the children, Marie, Margaret, and August, all moved away from the Central Valley. The oldest daughter, Marie, moved to San Francisco. So she actually lived there during the Great Earthquake of 1906. She had one of her daughters was injured in the earthquake. She lost a leg, and she became blind in the earthquake. And so my grandmother would talk about when they would come to visit, she would have this prosthetic leg, and they needed to help her. And she was always telling me, it was like, oh, it's from the earthquake. And I was like, well, that can't be right. And then I was like, no, that makes sense. So it's just amazing to see these little historical events that intertwined with them. She had another son. His name was Otto von Raven. He would have been the oldest of John and Catherine's grandchildren. He became a banker, and he had a house on Liberty Street in San Francisco. It's still there. My grandmother would always talk about, it just had these beautiful views of the bay. And one time we decided, we'll go there. We'll just kind of stand in front and see. And sure enough, it did have these beautiful sweeping views. Otto would invite his mother's siblings and their children to his house, and he would give his kind of like country cousins a taste of the city life. So he would take them to the aquarium at Golden Gate Park. Sometimes it would be 4th of July, and he would buy them sparklers, and they would play on these very steep streets, which of course very different.
Was this like in the 20s, 30s?
So this would have been in the 30s.
30s,
so,
okay.
Yeah, so yes, in the 1930s, he was doing that. They'd play with the sparklers. He had, and then in turn, he would take his family back to the Fresno area from time to time. So even though they lived far apart, they were still seeing each other. And this was after the grandparents, John and Catherine, would have passed away. Okay. The siblings were still keeping in touch. The other 2 siblings, Margaret and August, that also left the Central Valley, they came back as well. So they would continue to see each other. And then the Fresno the Fresno ones would go and see them. August lived in Richmond. Talk about, the Bay Bridge wasn't built at the time,
Right.
so they would have to drive their car onto a ferry to see him, and they'd collect shells with him. And then Margaret actually moved to Kansas. She would send her daughter to Fresno, and so that she could spend time with her Berg cousins. Mm-hmm. So, even though they were kind of far apart, these ties, they were still there.
And back in the 30s, it was a lot further than it is now.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. So my grandma, she would talk about it would take 12 hours to drive from Fresno to San Francisco. And so this is her actual quote. She said, "There were 10 of us in a 1930 Buick. The older children sat on the seat. The younger children, I was one of them, sat on the bench that my dad made. We would leave at 2 a.m. and arrive to our aunt and uncle's house at 2 p.m.
Wow.
It was a long trip.
Yeah.
I like how she would say it was a long trip.
Yeah.
But in fact, she would describe at some points, because there weren't the interstates that we have, and cars didn't go as fast as they do now. Her older brothers would jump out of the car and they would race the car, and they could sometimes go faster than the car could drive.
Oh, wow.
So it's incredible to me to think about how much effort it took to make these visits. Mm-hmm. Yet, they still did that. That was part of their kind of routine, and just something that they looked forward to.
It was important to them.
Yeah.
To keep the family. Yeah.
Then there were the two older sons, Peter and Henry. They were two of the sons that stayed in the area, and they, like their dad, became raisin growers. Peter lived in Parlier, and Henry lived in Raisin City. Mm-hmm. Peter, in particular, had a very large family. He had a few children with his first wife, and then she sadly passed away. So he married a woman that also was a widow. She had a few children, and then they had some children together. So all in all, they had 18 kids.
Oh, wow.
So when they would visit, you can imagine the visits with these cousins on cousins, and just how much, just you can imagine the chaos.
Yeah.
when they would all see each other.
Sure. Wow. I remember visiting my mom's sister. She had 4 children, and my family had 3. And they lived in a single wide trailer on a ranch. Yeah. And yes, there were bodies everywhere, but that's nothing compared to 18 children.
Yeah. So, I think it was that togetherness that they really enjoyed. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, they were the farm, or if you were in town, the streets were your playground. You could, just being able to play, and I think they had a lot of fun together. So the last sibling, Daniel, who is my great-grandfather, he moved from the country to Fresno to raise his family in Germantown. They lived in a house on F Street, so it was kind of catty corner from the Cross Church, the first site of the Cross Church, and sort of directly across from the parsonage. So they kind of lived in a very central area in terms of people passing by. It was the same street where the streetcar ran.
Oh, okay.
My grandmother would talk about they would take she and the kids who lived in the area, they would take bottle caps and put them on the trolley track car and make play money.
Oh, okay. It would smash them out.
It would flatten them, and they could have play money. I don't think the driver liked that.
Yeah.
But they thought it was quite fun. And then really living in Germantown, that was where my grandmother was born, and that's where her best stories came from. And I think that's kind of where she liked to return in her mind sometimes. This is a quote from her. She said, "We would meet in front of the church. Everyone had large families, so there were plenty of children. Our children would sit on the front porches, our parents would sit on the front porches and visit. It would be too hot to be indoors. We played games. We would choose sides and then play Run, Sheepy, Run. One side would hide, the other side would try to find them. We played hopscotch and jump rope. If we got a nickel, we could walk to Murray's for ice cream. We went to Cosmos Playground." So I just love that image
Yeah,
of just meeting at the church steps and then the parents sitting on the porches talking to each other. And of course, we know the hot Fresno nights and can imagine just, enjoying.
Yeah, and how warm it would be inside without our modern conveniences.
Exactly. Yes. But my favorite part of this, she didn't include in this written account, but my favorite part of this is that when she and her friends would get into any kind of mischief while they were out and about in Germantown, like clockwork, someone would stop them and say, "I know who your father is. Tell me your name."
Yeah.
And then she would say, "Well, if you know who my father is, you would know my name." But of course, they all knew each other. Mm-hmm. And even though she might not tell them who her name was, by the time she got home, her parents would already know whatever kind of mischief she got into.
Sure.
And the best part was they didn't even have telephones, but it just really spoke to how closely
the community was. Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah. So, news traveled fast.
Yeah.
Like I said, she really loved living in Germantown, and said it was nice to grow up among our own people. She would say that, their world was very small and she only knew the Germantown children until she went to high school. And then she would proudly say there were 33 nationalities at Edison High. So their world, expanded very quickly. Mm-hmm. And, ultimately, John and Catherine's grandchildren were able to, attend university. Some of them went to Fresno State or Berkeley, Stanford. One of the grandchildren, Rudy Berg, went on to own Berg Motors in Midland, Texas. Otto Berg was an attorney here in Fresno, and Walt Berg was the city of Fresno controller, among many other grandchildren. They all have their own stories. Some very proudly served in the U.S. military during World War II in Korea. And some of the granddaughters served on the home front as real-life Rosie the Riveters. And then, many were deeply involved in their churches, communities, and other civic organizations. And, they raised their families here in Fresno and beyond. I mentioned that they had 46 grandchildren in total. Their last living grandchild was my grandmother, Margaret Berg Seib, and she passed away at age 100 in December of 2023. Her Volga German heritage was just so important to her, and as was being part of the Berg family. These were stories that I've heard my entire life, and I think she just really loved to recount those stories, but also just pass on that heritage. And the reason that I can talk about it is because she talked about it and and wrote many of those stories down.
She actually wrote them down herself.
She did.
That's great.
Yeah, when I was a baby, my mom gave her one of those little books, like grandmother's memories, and my grandmother was always someone. She never did something at a 10. She did things at a 12. She was go big or go home. Mm-hmm. So she filled in every piece of that book and then went on to there's notes in the margins where she would say, I called my brother Walt, or I called my sister, and what they said I should also include this information.
Oh, that's cool.
So that's a lot of the the details that we have are because she was so diligent in writing those things down, or kind of labeling photos. So that's something I'm really grateful for. That I think to know your past is to know a little bit more about yourself, and in having those stories from her, it kind of feel like I know where I've come from.
Yeah.
A lot better. I have just such a greater appreciation for that. I can remember, going to college and people would say, "Oh, Fresno, your Fresno area. How did your family end up there? What was it like growing up there?" And I'd be like, "Well, let me tell you.
You knew."
It was not an accident. I never felt like, oh, I just ended up here. I don't have any ties to there. But to understand this kind of, that I'm kind of just a small thread in this whole fabric, this whole story is, it gives you a different sense of self. I think.
Yep. It's brought me joy for sure.
Yeah.
Any story I hear, even if it's not all that colorful, it's
Yeah.
still a piece of my history.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know when the other part of the story that I had shared when we took our field trip back in October was, I kind of was like, well, what's the ending to all of this? What does it mean? And I started to realize I was driving. I live in Northern California, and I was driving home, to the valley, and I was thinking I'm going on the same road essentially that my family did. The Bergs would when they were going back up to the Bay Area to visit their family. Mm-hmm. And I've made that drive many, many times in the last 20 years. But that was the first time I really thought of it in that way. And then I started kind of thinking more. It's like, well, I didn't grow up in Fresno, but I grew up in another small valley, close-knit community. And if I got into some mischief, my parents would probably have heard about it before I got home, not unlike my grandmother living in Germantown. And, they lived right by the Cross Church. And I was baptized actually at the Cross Church, but I grew up going to a Lutheran church in where I grew up. And then the funniest thing that I truly never really thought about is my career has been in the raisin industry, which was which was an industry that my great grandfather was part of, as were so many Volga Germans.
Yes, yes.
And it was just something that was just factual to me. It wasn't. I never really thought about that, but it was to think about those threads. It kind of made me appreciate what I do a little bit more.
Right, in a different way. Yeah, like honoring your heritage by continuing the tradition.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so I said it before, but I think it's the work that, you do here and, the podcast is just that's how we continue those stories, and just, create better understanding with ourselves. Mm-hmm, so I'm so appreciative of that.
Thank you. Well, I'm hoping to meet with others like I'm meeting with you and have them share their stories as well, because like we both have said over and over again, the more you learn about your own heritage and your own history, the more you can learn about yourself.
Yes.
And so I think that that's a great point to continue to encourage people to ask questions of their oldest relatives and write things down and also do research.
Absolutely.
Because we can always find something more. There's always something more to find.
For sure. And just, I think sometimes maybe, we think about we've heard stories, and then to understand, see what the facts and the documents are, it just paints such a vivid picture. Like, I'd always heard about, they came, my great grandparents came here. And then I remember when I discovered the newspaper article, I was like, wow, this is real. This is, there other people, heard this story too.
Mm-hmm. And there's a picture of them in that Cross Church history books.
Yes.
There's pictures of them in there too. So yeah they're real people. Real important people for sure. Do you still have any burning questions that you care to research, or anything that you...
That's a really good question. So a lot of what I've done since probably in the last 7 or 8 years, I've really, when my grandmother was still living, what I was really trying to do was understand and document the things that she had, to kind of ask her questions and fill in those blank spots. I think a lot of people tend to try to go back where I was going sideways, to fill in her cousins and fill in her aunts and uncles, because that was a little bit closer, and I could still capture that information firsthand. And I think I've done a pretty good job of filling in those blanks. But next step is I do want to understand more about what was happening on the Volga, more of where they lived. So that's kind of my next project.
Now, I don't know if it was you, but someone in your family created a book.
Yeah, so
about your grandmother?
Yeah,
tell me about that.
Yeah, so I mentioned when I was a baby, my mom had given her this book that she just diligently filled in. And then she gave it to me as an adult, that when she had when she had filled it in, but it was handwritten. And I was the only grandchild that had it. So we said, we need to make sure that there's a copy for everyone. So my mom and I started typing it out, which was quite a project. And then from there, putting it into trying to find photos and add, be able to put that together to really make it more of a story and kind of a document. So we were able to share it with some of our family members. Mm-hmm. And then we also made a version for the library here that includes kind of the stories of her living in Germantown, and a little bit about her parents. So her dad, Daniel, that I mentioned, and his parents who came over, as well as her mom, who she came from Russia, and then my grandfather, his parents, who also came. So there's a little that entire piece of my family can be documented, and it's kind of a nice reference too.
Yeah. I haven't read through the whole thing yet, but I plan to, because I do love people hearing other stories, and a lot of it will sound familiar to me now that we've talked again. Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Tracy, so much for sitting down with me today. And I just enjoy hearing your story so much. And Happy New Year, everybody.
Well, yes, Happy New Year to you.
Thank you for listening to the Germans from Russia experience. I hope that something you heard today will inspire you to learn anything and everything you can about your ancestors. If you like what you heard, please leave a review, like, and share this podcast. You can comment directly by emailing me at thegrexperience@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Also, like my Facebook page, the Germans from Russia Experience Podcast. There you will find photos of the Berg family. Please see my show notes for website suggestions to begin or continue your discovery of your Germans from Russia roots. My podcast artwork is by Matt Wall. My producer is Annie Anderson.